Okay, my name is Stacey Reynolds. I am currently at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm in the occupational therapy department. I spent 2.5 years at the University of Florida on an NIH Career Development Award, and at that time I was contacted along with my colleagues Roxana Bendixson and Consuelo Kreider, who is here today, to come in and take a look at these guys with Barth that apparently had some sensory things going on. And that was sort of the information that we got coming into the 2010 conference. So today I'm going to walk you a little bit through our journey in researching these sensory issues and how we've really focused our efforts in the last few years on taste sensitivity and food preferences in this population. Why do we care about this? As occupational therapists, we do a lot of work with kids with sensory issues. A lot of that is seen in the autism population, which you may hear about. It's in the popular media a lot more than Barth syndrome. But really, we care about this because you, as the Barth syndrome community, care about this. And I'm speaking mainly to parents and affected individuals in that this is affecting your daily lives. It's affecting how you're feeding your kids, what meal times are like in your household. And as individuals with Barth, it may affect your social interactions and the things that you're eating or doing with your peers. We all use mealtime as a big social time. It also is of interest to the Barth community because characteristics of Barth may be influenced by eating habits and secondarily nutrition, particularly a lot of the things that people have been talking about today, like growth delays, skeletal musculature, and muscle weakness. And so I think it's still unclear at this time the interface between diet and musculature and fatigue and all of those other things in this specific population, but I certainly think that is going to be a topic of further discussion as we learn more about all of these different areas. And what we hope to add, and what I hope to add in this talk, is the sensory piece that has been missing from that conversation for a while. So again, I was introduced to this community in 2010 with Dr. Kreider and Dr. Bendixson. And not knowing really what these sensory issues were, we started out really basic and giving parents a questionnaire. And this was a questionnaire for parents to fill out who had boys between 0 and 17 years of age. And actually, there was a separate questionnaire for those boys who were 12 years and older, and they were able to fill it out themselves. And what we found just with this basic short sensory profile was that about 75% of boys with Barth had scores in the atypical sensory processing range. And this was a general total score. So this was auditory, tactile, taste, smell, vestibular based. But the real profound difference was in this area of taste and smell sensitivity. And when I talk about this sensory profile, lower scores mean a higher incidence of dysfunction. So just this paper pencil report said kids with Barth seem to have greater sensitivity to taste and smell than typical controls. We also did a qualitative research study that year, and that was published in 2012. I'm not sure. Yeah, there's the reference and at the end of this slide. But we interviewed parents and boys with Barth, and we said, okay, you're a picky eater. Tell me more about that. And what kept coming up over and over again was this strong preference for salty, cheesy foods. And it was really not just I like French fries and potato chips, because who doesn't, really? I mean, we all do. But it was this extreme, and this was my favorite quote, and I'm not sure who this was, but it was his description of how he eats French fries, and it's, I'll take vinegar, I put salt in that, I take ketchup, put it in the vinegar, put more salt on, and dip my fries in it. So, and this was not the only example, and all of the parents that came in for this talk probably can give me more. And I was talking to one family today whose child was just eating the shredded cheese from the salad bar at lunch, and that was lunch. But this salty, cheesy was really extreme. So in 2012, and that's the data I'm going to be reporting on today, we decided to look at this further and see what these dietary preferences were and see if we could quantify that in some way. and take it a step further beyond the behavioral questionnaires and say, is there some sort of genetic predisposition to the salty tastes or other chemical tastes that would predispose them to be picky eaters or to have these really strong food preferences? So our standard research questions were just, are these boys different from a typical control group in the areas of chemical taste sensitivity, behavioral reports of taste, smell, and tactile sensitivity, their food behaviors, and this was asking parents about a history of gag reflex, swallowing problems, having to make different meals for their child, different meals from the family for their child, and then their dietary preferences. So I'll go through how we measured all of those things. And then we also wanted to know whether the sensory characteristics that we were looking at were actually predictive of the dietary intake. So we had a total sample of 50 children. 24 of them were boys with Barth syndrome. And again, I'm going to use the term boys to refer to boys and men, the male characteristics. 24, and that was up to age 17 for this study. And typical individuals, 26 of them, again, between the ages of 5 and 17. Parents or the individual completed a sensory profile. We had a modified food inventory and chemical taste strips for all of them. And again, I'll talk about those measures in a minute. All of the data collected on boys with Barth was at the 2012 conference, and typically developing boys, we collected that data this year after I'd gone back to Virginia Commonwealth, so all of the kids were collected from the Richmond area. Most of that was done through word of mouth at schools and churches, and you'll see that the age mean for the two groups is slightly different. My pointer is acting up. The Barth boys were slightly younger overall, and so in all of our statistical analyses that I'll report on, we accounted for age as a covariate, meaning we tried to statistically account for that difference in age because our typical sample was slightly older.
You do have you do have a separate pointer up there. It's green.
I see it. Thank you. All right. So again, these are our three measures. The chemical taste strips were, if the parents who are here remember, or the boys, were strips of paper that were saturated in a chemical. And we focused really on two chemicals. One is PTC. I'm not going to try and say the official name for it. It's a bitter tasting chemical that that bitter taste is found in a lot of leafy green vegetables and other types of bitter foods. And often if you hear in the media somebody being referred to as a super taster, it often means that they can taste this chemical more strongly than most people. We also looked at another chemical taste called sodium benzoate, which is a salty tasting chemical. And obviously we were interested in this because of the boys' desire to eat a lot of salty foods. The method was that the children washed their mouth out with water several times to cleanse their palate. We would place the strip on their tongue and have them close their mouth, count for 10 seconds, and then they would rate the taste on a scale similar to this, and they could put their finger anywhere on the line. I will say that we did try and do this with some younger kids, the 3 and 4-year-olds, and even though some of them let us put the strip on their tongue, they weren't able to accurately report. Even some of our 5 and 6-year-olds had trouble with this, so we did have to exclude some kids. Despite them trying the task, they weren't able to complete the rating scale, but we were able to get data on some of the younger 5 and 6-year-old kids. Again, parents filled out a short sensory profile for us so that we could look at the behavioral reports of sensory processing. We only analyzed the tactile and taste smell sensitivity domains this year, again, because they were we thought would be most likely related to the feeding and eating behaviors. And then parents and boys also filled out a modified food inventory. And it asked about food behaviors like having a history of food refusal, dysphagia or gag reflex. Dysphagia is a term for difficulty swallowing. Whether or not the parent or caregiver had to provide separate meals for their child with Barth, what their appetite was like, and whether or not the overall eating habits matched the family. And this is the actual food inventory filled out. It lists, it was over 100 foods. They would list the food, ask how often that child ate the food, and whether that food was eaten by the family. So we calculated the score of whether or not the habits matched the family by looking at whether or not the child ate the food. And if the child didn't eat the food, I think there's an example somewhere here, the child doesn't eat the food and the family does, that was considered a mismatch. And so we calculated a total score for habit matching. After we had all the data, we broke down the foods into 8 different categories to be able to look at specific trends in food refusal or food preference. One category was salty, cheesy. There was a category for sweets, proteins, bitter foods, general fruits, citrus fruits, vegetables, and that says general vegetables, but bitter vegetables counted in 2 places. So it would count as a general vegetable, but also for a bitter food if it had the bitter dark green quality to it. And then we had a category for just foods that didn't fit in any one particular domain, and those weren't used in this analysis. We also looked at frequency with which foods were eaten, and so we rated whether if the child didn't eat the food, that was a score of 0, all the way up to a 3, which was child eats the food several times a day. We used Fisher's exact test and Pearson chi-square to do our analysis of differences between Barth and typical boys, and one-way analysis of variance models to look at the influence of the sensory characteristics on the feeding behaviors. And again, statistically, we accounted for age in our models as much as we could. So results. So the PTC taster status, that was the strip, the bitter strip that we put on their tongue. For the non-statisticians in the audience, a significant value is one that is below 0.05. So there is a statistically significant difference between our Barth and control groups in terms of taster status for the bitter compound PTC. And the most interesting part of this was really that boys with Barth were more likely to be super tasters to PTC, which is that bitter compound. Similarly, we had a significant difference in groups to NAB is the sodium benzoate. There's a significant difference between groups here. And while more typical kids were super tasters, a very low number. And what actually seems to be the most significant is that boys with Barth were more likely to be non-tasters to the sodium benzoate, which is that salty compound. So they don't appear to perceive the salt as strongly as kids in the control group. I'll get back to that later when we talk about the foods they were eating. This is the scores from the short sensory profile. Again, there's a significant difference between our Barth kids and the control group. And for this slide, the colors are referring to statistical or standard deviations, where green is reflected as typical processing, so within 1 standard deviation, probable difference, and definite difference categories, with definite difference being outside of 2 standard deviations. So as you can see for taste, smell, sensitivity, whereas about 20% of kids in the control group were in either probable or definite difference. 50% or about, 50% of kids with Barth were in that either probable difference or definite difference category. So that's similar to what we had found before, that at least half of the kids with Barth had reports of differences in taste, smell, sensitivity. And again, this is a behavioral report, not an objective measure. For tactile sensitivity, there was not a significant difference between boys with Barth and our control group, with similar numbers between the two in terms of typical processing, probable difference, and definite difference. So one of the things that was unclear in our qualitative study before was whether or not kids were avoiding certain textures, whether it was creamy textures or lumpy textures or certain temperatures that they were really trying to avoid. And that was less consistent than the cravings for certain taste. And this just solidified the fact that this may not be as much of a tactile issue as it is a taste-smell issue. When we looked at the types of foods being eaten by the two groups, again, across the bottom, these are our 8 categories that we grouped the different foods into. And on the left side here, on the vertical axis, is a frequency count, meaning how often were those foods eaten. So the categories aren't the same because there weren't the same number of citrus fruits in our questionnaire as there were salty, cheesy foods. So really what you're looking to do here is compare boys with Barth and controls. And you'll see that our p-value did not reach 0.05. So overall for this questionnaire, there was not a significant difference in the amount of foods eaten. There was not a significant difference in the amount of foods eaten by the two different groups, although it approaches significance. The trends, I think, are in the expected direction here, though. Boys with Barth are eating less fruits overall, and they're eating less citrus fruits. They're also eating less vegetables, less bitter foods, which, again, this category includes some of those bitter vegetables, those dark leafy greens. And they're eating less sweets, which was something that, again, came out of our qualitative interviews, that these kids aren't craving cakes and other sweets as you know, at a really high level, not so different from typical kids. They're eating about the same amount of proteins, which I've learned today that a lot of them are getting increased proteins in their diet, so that might be the cause for that. And as we expected, the boys with Barth are eating more salty, cheesy foods, eating those more frequently than the control groups. Again, on that food inventory, we asked about specific food behaviors, and there were significant differences on all of the food behaviors that we looked at. So I'll go through these fairly quickly. Boys with Barth are more likely to have current or history of food refusal compared to typical controls. And again, history of food refusal and controls is at 15.4%, and at least half of the boys with Barth have a history or current issues with food refusal. Dysphagia, which was included as difficulty swallowing or a strong gag reflex that impacts swallowing, was present in 70.8% of boys with Barth and only 3.8% of our typical control group. Having to prepare separate meals for your child was reported in 58% of boys with or families with Barth, compared to less than a quarter of kids in the control group. Habits matching the family, again, looking at foods that the family eats that the child with Barth won't eat, was significantly different, with more than half of the families having a high level of mismatch compared to the control group. And appetite was about 50% of the boys in the Barth group had appetites that were reported as being poor to fair, whereas that was less than 20% of the control group. So I don't think those numbers are all that surprising to most people, but it does provide an objective measure of the things that parents have been reporting for a while. We did go and look to see if any of the sensory measures that we were using were predictive of the food preferences that were reported. And they were not. Most of them were not, at least not with the chemical taste strips. But the trends were in the expected direction. So the bitter taste, the PTC, did not significantly predict the overall food preferences. But if we look at bitter foods, so if somebody is a super taster to that bitter compound, we would expect them to eat less bitter foods. They're gonna detect that taste more intensely and probably avoid it. Bitter is not a pleasant taste. And we see that non-tasters do tend to eat more vegetables than moderate tasters, and then even more so than super tasters. So the trend is right, but the significance is not there. That's similar to looking at the kids who are non-tasters to sodium benzoate. If they aren't detecting that salty compound, they may need more of it to reach threshold to be able to taste it and enjoy their food. And we do see that non-tasters eat more salty, cheesy foods than moderate tasters, but again, that value did not reach significance. And there were no boys with Barth that were super tasters to the sodium benzoate. There were in the control group, but these are all just kids with Barth. There was a link or a relationship between scores on the short sensory profile and the taste-smell domain, and the history of food refusal. So again, lower scores on the sensory profile mean more dysfunction. So children that had more taste smell sensitivities were more likely to be reported as having food refusal compared to kids with higher scores on the short sensory profile not having a history of food refusal. And that reached significance. Approaching significance was this idea of habits matching the family. So if the child had higher scores, their habits were more likely to match the family. So the short sensory profile does seem to be a useful tool in thinking about and talking about food-related behaviors. And it, as a paper pencil questionnaire, may be worth including for some of you who do multidisciplinary clinics and are working with families on a regular basis. It may be helpful to include and discuss with families related to eating, feeding and eating. So to wrap up, our findings support our previously published qualitative studies that suggest that boys with Barth have food behaviors and sensitivities that are significantly different from typically developing peers. These behaviors seem to be due to differences in the perception of chemical tastes and taste smell sensitivity. Our data did not point to tactile issues as being the major barrier to feeding in this population. Again, boys with PTC tasted that bitter compound. Boys with Barth tasted that bitter compound much more intensely than typical boys, suggesting a higher sensitivity to bitter compounds in foods such as vegetables. On the flip side, they were more likely to be non-tasters to the salty tasting chemical, suggesting an under-responsiveness or a decreased perception of the saltiness in foods. Our data did not support previous research in the general population that suggests that taster status significantly influences dietary predictions or dietary intake, but the trends were in the predicted direction, so it may be worth continuing to look at those relationships. And again, on the short sensory profile, the taste smell sensitivities reported by individuals and parents were related to food refusal and eating habits. The limitations of this study, we were unhappy with the food questionnaire that we chose to use, and that was a standard one out of the nursing literature. But it didn't really get at the heart of, it asked parents a lot of questions, and you might have noticed that it went from, do I eat this food, do I never eat this food, do I eat this food every week? And it didn't account for like those foods that you only eat on certain holidays. So it asked about cranberry sauce. Well, you know, I don't eat it every week, but it's not like I never eat it. And so when we talked to a lot of people filling those questionnaires out, they were unsure how to answer. And so we didn't feel completely confident with that data. So those of you parents that are here now, you filled out a different questionnaire for us this year. We tried to make it user-friendly. We tried to really just focus on the foods that we were interested in. And we asked you to rate how often it was eaten on a more continuous scale, and then also how much your child liked that food, so that we could get a sense of were they eating it because you were making them, or are they eating it because they really are choosing to eat it. So again, we've tried to resolve some of the issues with that, and grouping the foods based on USDA categories instead of us trying to decide where they fit best. And again, another limitation is the fact that we didn't measure the sense of smell. We only looked at that in terms of the behavioral questionnaire. And so this year, this is sort of our process of doing the work in 2010, the data that I just reported from 2012, and we did get a grant from the Barth Syndrome Foundation to continue this research. And this year, many of you may have participated, we did a smell threshold test where we're looking at the ability of the boys to perceive and detect certain odors. We are going to take our taste testing a step further, where we're counting the density of receptors on the tongue and looking at the influence of that receptor density to taste and food preferences. And we're going to be collecting videos to account for and begin to quantify these early oral motor and general motor delays in kids under 2 years of age. And so we're hoping that this process is going to inform families and help relieve the stress that feeding often causes, problems with feeding often causes. And hopefully this information can be integrated with the other studies going on and inform nutritionists or nutrition studies and issues around diet. So my final thoughts, and hopefully I'm still on time, is that in this study, the families were identifying feeding and eating problems pretty much at birth or before 6 months of age. And so that can be really, really stressful as a new mom and your kid's not eating, and that's not just with Barth syndrome. But if we know within the Barth population that these are issues for families, then we as researchers, clinicians, other parents, need to find ways to support them. I think that in addition to just considering what kind of nutrients these kids are getting and are they eating and what are they eating and how much, there can be a greater emphasis placed on developing skills that support feeding. So even if your child's not able to eat, they can begin mouthing toys. That's really important in working that gag reflex back and not having such a hypersensitive gag. They can suck on toys. They can begin to practice swallowing certain foods or chewing and strengthening the musculature in the mouth. And then finding ways to reduce or prevent sensory hypersensitivities. So kids that are G-tube fed and don't get the touch and the tactile on the face and inside the mouth are probably going to be more likely to have hypersensitivities. And there are ways to prevent those from becoming worse than they need to be. I think that having a greater integration of ideas that revolve around the sensory and the motor and the dietary aspects of feeding it's going to be really important, and continuing the multidisciplinary efforts that everybody is already doing. And for those of you that don't have an OT on your team, the sensory aspect is important to consider, and I think that it's important to find a place for that, and OTs do have an expertise in doing the sensory aspect. So these are the references. Like I said, we did publish the original study in the American Journal of Medical Genetics, and that was in 2012, and we're working on getting the data that was presented here out this summer. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Stacey. So we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Hi Stacey, it's Nicole, the dietitian from the Barth Syndrome Service. Just to say, really great study and presentation, and I think the information about the salt will provide a lot of comfort to a lot of parents in that they need more salt in order to taste. One of my questions was, the bitter compounds are also found in cheese. So did you have any thoughts about why they liked cheese and not vegetables, or...?
Yeah, the cheeses, and we got a little stuck with where to qualify some of the foods on that food inventory, and so we tended to exclude, blue cheese, I believe, was on there, and that tends to be a more bitter cheese. So I think we did not include that in salty cheesy, but the Velveeta-y cheese that they really liked, the fake cheese, that was on there. So we did get stuck with where to put those, and I don't know that all cheese has the same level of bitterness. So it would be interesting to talk with you and compare, which foods are contributing more. But in the bitter group, we really focused on those bitter green vegetables that are in the literature, and then some of the other foods, or cranberry sauce that had those strongly bitter tastes.
Thank you.